Welcome back to the Introduction to Watercolor class, everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a demonstration of autumn leaves. Autumn is a beautiful time of year here in central Pennsylvania, and watercolor is a perfect medium for capturing the beautiful colors of fall foliage. So the leaves that I have for this demonstration are green. They're not autumn leaves at all. It's the middle of July here. But I think I can just make up the colors of autumn for these leaves, and I'm going to take a look at some different images online. Here's the first leaf I'm going to paint today. This is a maple leaf. I've put a light source to the side that I set up just to create sort of a longer dramatic cast shadow, because I'm going to include that in the painting as well. I'm going to be starting with a modified contour drawing of my leaves. I would suggest watching a previous video I've done on contour drawings. It just covers some of the basic techniques for it. You can see that I didn't tape down all the edges of my paper to a watercolor board today. I just have it taped down to the surface of the table I'm painting on. We're not going to be covering the entire paper, so I'm not too worried about the paper buckling or warping. I've got my graphite pencil and I'm going to begin a modified contour. And this is just going to be a quick, fun kind of exercise. We're not going for photographic realism here. We're just going to do a simple modified contour drawing and then fill in the colors using some quick and fun techniques with watercolor. And I want to try to get it to fill the paper. If the contour is a little bit off proportionally, it's not a big deal, especially with a leaf. Let's face it, leaves can come in all different shapes and sizes, and it's not going to be real noticeable if it's different from the original. I want to include all the outer edges of the leaf in my contour. I'm going to include the stem of the leaf and that piece of a twig that's still attached to the leaf. I think that's a pretty interesting little element for this painting, so I want to include that too. I also want to get most of the really pronounced vein patterns that I can see on the interior of the leaf. With this first painting, I want to try to outline the outer edges and the main vein patterns in the middle of the leaf with marker. This is an ultra fine point marker. I just think it'll add a little bit of emphasis to the edges, so it's a fun thing to do. And again, I don't have to trace over my lines exactly. In fact, sometimes it's kind of fun to make corrections with the marker and let the old line drawing with the graphite show through. It just spices the painting up, makes it a little more interesting to look at. My modified contour drawing is done, and now I'm ready to paint. I came close to running off the edges of the paper, but that's okay. Now we're ready to begin mixing colors. You can really use whatever color combination you want to. I looked just online at a few different fall or autumn colored leaves just to get an idea of what colors I wanted to use. So I decided to use yellow, red, and green. I'm going to make a puddle of each of those colors. A reminder, you want to make sure that you have enough color mixed on the back of your paint tray to be able to finish the job. And so I'm going to need a good bit because the leaf is pretty big on my paper. By the way, I'm using cold press 90-pound watercolor paper. My colors are mixed, and what I'm going to do next is wet in the entire area of the leaf. I've decided to do this first leaf in a wet technique. Those who follow the class would have seen that in a previous video. And I want to be careful to try to fill in just to the very tips and pointed edges of the leaf with this one. The brush works best for this, for those pointed edges, if you just barely touch it and kind of pull it as you're stroking away from those pointed edges to fill in with water. You can also see a little bit of glare from the water. That's a good way to be able to tell if you've got the entire area covered with water. You can kind of move your head around and tilt it until you can see that glare or reflection over top of every area. that you want to fill in. That's a good trick to use to make sure that it's actually coated with water. I'm just having fun. So I'm going to start with yellow and start dotting and dabbing it in there along the vein patterns in the leaf. I'm using kind of a hit or miss approach. I'm not trying to fill in every single vein pattern, and I'm not too worried about the kind of unpredictable results of the wet and wet, because autumn leaves can be pretty random. Okay, now I'm going to move on to my red. I actually decided to mix a little bit of orange in there with it as well, just to get that kind of fiery red look that I see in a lot of autumn leaves. And I'm going to start by dotting in or dabbing in the red toward those pointed edges of the leaves. That's something, color pattern I observed on some of the leaves that I looked at. Again, it's just kind of a hit or miss type thing. I'm not too worried about getting the red in specific areas. I just want to get it in there and let the watercolor bleed together and do its thing. Now I'm going to move on to the green. And I'm really just going to fill in some of the areas that I've left alone, that I've left white for now. And then I'm also going to dot in some green a little heavier in a few spots. And I like that, but I think I'm going to add some more color, some darker color. So what I'm going to do is mix some red and some green that's a little bit thicker, a little bit drier. That is more pigment and less water. As I dab these colors in, it's going to be more like dry and wet. Again, we looked at that in a previous video. I'm going to use this darker green color that I've created to put in a few of the vein patterns. I'm going to dot in a few darker areas of red as well. And I want that red to be dark, so I'm going to add just a little bit of green into the red too, to really make it darker and more neutral, so it looks more shadowy. But look, for this one, you don't have to do what I do. You can select different colors. I mean, yours should look different than mine. Just have fun with it. Okay, I like the leaf. I'm going to leave that alone for now. I don't think I'll do anything more to it, but I'm not sure. Now I'm going to move on to that twig. So I'm going to clean the paint tray off, and I'm going to mix a light color for the lighter areas of that twig. I'm using a combination of yellow and orange. And for the shadowy or darker areas of that twig, I'm going to use a combination of brown and blue. This is a combination I use a lot for neutral colored objects, things like wood. In this case, I want it to be a little warmer since it is wood, so I'm using a bit more brown in the mixture than blue. I'm starting by filling in the twig with that yellow-orange mixture. I'm going to avoid a little round highlight on the end of that twig. I'm going to leave that white. But I'm going to fill in pretty much everything else except just a few little spots where I do see a little highlight. I'll leave those white as well. Now while it's still wet, I'm going to dot in a few areas with the darker color that I've got, my dark neutral color. I'm almost just touching spots where I see these little knots on the twig, and there's kind of like a little shadowy area underneath them. But again, this doesn't have to be perfect. We're not going for photorealism here. Now I'm going to let that dry, clean off my tray. Next, we're going to work on the cast shadow. There's a technique that we need to use called softening the edge, okay, or softening edges. Before we paint in the cast shadow for the maple leaf, we're going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to show you a close-up demonstration of a quick approach to creating a cast shadow and softening the edge. So for the top puddle, I've got a mixture of blue and brown with water, and think of it as the middle tone. What I've done is I've mixed either equal or even a little bit more blue in the mixture than brown, so it has sort of a cool gray look. And then for the bottom color, I've got a mixture of blue and brown with much less water, and I've also included some black to make it even more dark. I'm going to start with the lightest value color at the top. I'm just filling in like a little section of a cast shadow for part of a leaf here. So in this leaf, and this is actually part of the next demonstration you'll see, but the leaf is kind of curled over, and there's a tip, that pointed tip of it, which is touching the table. So it's got this unique sort of shape. I fill in with that lightest color first, and then I'm going to clean my brush off, and then I'm just going to take my fingers and kind of squeeze it a little bit. Now I'm going to take that semi-dry or semi-wet, whatever you prefer, brush, and I'm going to go around those outer edges of the cast shadow. And really what I'm doing is hitting most of those areas that are the furthest away from the leaf. I'm going to let that little teeny line where the leaf touches the table alone. Now I'm going to take my darkest color and just fill it in right next to the leaf, more toward the center of that cast shadow, and just touch that pointed edge of the cast shadow, because those are the places where it's closest to making contact with the leaf. And then I'm going to let that bleed and gradually blend and dry. Now let's take a look at it after it's had a chance to dry and spread out a bit more and blend. It gives a pretty good effect of that cast shadow. Cast shadows tend to be darkest and more crisp right up next to the object, and then get lighter and more soft on those edges that are further away from the object. Okay, let's get started on the cast shadow for the maple leaf. And I've got my two colors mixed. Remember that top color is a mixture of blue and brown. I use a little bit more blue than brown in the mixture to make it sort of cool. And that bottom color is my darkest. It's a combination of blue and brown with less water, and I've included some black in the mixture. Now this shadow is more complex, but that's okay. I'm going to do it in sections. I'll start with my top color, my lightest color, on the edge of the leaf and work my way out. I'm trying to get the shape that I saw. I didn't draw it in first. There's places where it's spread further away from the leaf and other areas where it's pretty close right up next to it. If it's a little bit off, again, it's not going to matter. We're not going for perfection here. Now I'm going to take my brush, clean it out, dry it off a little bit, either with my fingers or my sponge, and I'm going to soften those edges, especially the ones that are furthest from the leaf. That's the best way to mimic that effect of cast shadows. Now I'm going to add a little bit more black to that darkest color, and I'm going to dot in, notice right up next to the edge of the leaf where that cast shadow is darkest. And I don't want to go all the way out to the edge with it. I just want to dab it in there and then let it bleed into that lighter area of the cast shadow. That creates a nice gradation from dark to light. Now with this leaf, there's a few other cast shadows on different sections of it. I'm going to fill those in with the same process. Start with my lightest color first. And I'm going to carefully, just trying with the point of the brush, to fill in right along those edges. That one section of the cast shadow that's furthest away, I'm going to take my brush, clean it off, and dry it just a bit with my fingers or the sponge. And I'm just going to hit the edges of that furthest area of cast shadow that's furthest from the leaf to get a softened edge. And then finally take my darkest color and just dot in a couple places where it's right up next to the leaf to make it more intense. Now I'm just going to show you a few glimpses where I'm going to finish the rest of the little cast shadow areas that I see, including a cast shadow along the twig. I'm using that same process of using the lightest color first, softening some of the edges that are furthest away from the forms, and then dotting in just a little bit of that darkest color in those darkest areas of the cast shadow. And that's it for that one. I'm going to let that one thoroughly dry. We're talking 15 to 20 minutes. And let's take a look at the finished product. I'm pretty pleased with it. I think I got a really nice effect. It was a lot of fun. It wasn't anything real tedious. Okay, now I'm going to create another painting. Here, I'll show you an image of the leaf that I'm going to be painting. I'm no biologist, so I looked this up online, and it is called, I believe it's a tulip tree leaf. You can feel free to contact me and correct me if I'm wrong. I really like the look of it. It's a real dramatic kind of shape, and I got a pretty dramatic lighting effect on this one too. I'm going to start again with my modified contour drawing. So I'm going to go ahead and complete that. I'm not worried about perfection. Like I said before, I'm going to try to get all the outer edges and shapes of the leaf, and also some of the major vein patterns that we see in the center. I'm going to include the stem of the leaf. If it's a little off, that's okay, because leaves come in many different shapes. I am trying to fill the area of the paper though, and make it at least life size. For this painting, I've decided not to outline the contour in marker. I'm going to go with more of a what we would call a warm color palette. I'm just going to stick with red, orange, and yellow for this one. And I'll mix my puddles of color that I need on the back of the tray. Make sure I've got enough so that I can finish that whole area of the leaf because it's pretty big. The process I'm going to use for this one is a variegated technique. It's going to look similar to wet and wet, but it's going to be a little softer and not as dramatic in the color changes. I'm going to fill in this entire leaf with yellow first. And I want to do this fairly quickly because I don't want the painting to have a chance to dry, or that yellow to have a chance to dry. So I've got to work quickly. And I've got to make sure that I have enough yellow mixed, because I don't want to spend time having to mix more yellow paint. So I'm going to fill in this whole shape of the leaf with yellow. And I'll try to be careful. I am trying to be careful, but if I mess it up a little bit on the edge, it's okay. Now, before the yellow has a chance to dry, I'm going to start to dot in some of my orange. And with the orange, I'm sticking along some of the edges and the vein patterns that I see. And you can see how that color is bleeding and blending into the yellow. And I'm adding some of that into the points of the leaf. I'm trying to be precise or get it within those edges of the leaf, but I'm still working quickly. And last, I'm going to use red, and I'm going to dot it in a few places, especially on the tips of the leaf, and just kind of touch a few areas on the inside of some of the veins. You can see it's bleeding into those other colors. This one is a little bit more subtle in the way that it looks than the previous one that I did. it can be pretty random. I'm not really following anything here. I'm just kind of making it up based on some different images that I've seen. Before I'm finished here, I want to add a few real dark areas. So I'm going to take some green and mix it into my red to create a very dark neutral color. What this is going to create is almost a dry and wet sort of look. So I'm going to take that dark neutral that I mixed using the red and the green, and it has much less water and more pigment. And especially along the center part of those veins, a couple of those vein patterns, I'm just going to add a few quick strokes. And instead of mixing a new color for the stem of the leaf, I'm just going to use the colors that I already have here. I'll fill it in with orange and red, and then I'm going to take some of that dark color that I mixed and dot in toward the end where it's darker. Now I'm going to let that dry, and we're going to move on to the cast shadow. Now I'm going to mix those two colors I need for my cast shadow. The top one is that mixture of blue and brown with a little more blue in the mixture and some water to make it a middle tone. The bottom color is going to be much darker. It's blue and brown with less water and some black added to it to make it even darker. I'm starting with that lightest color, the middle tone. And I'm going to carefully go around the edges of this leaf to create the shape that I need for that cast shadow. And I'm going to finish this one section of cast shadow first before I move on to the next, just so that it doesn't get a chance to dry too much. So I filled that in. Now I'm going to clean off my brush and then just quickly dab it on the sponge or wipe it off with my fingers so that it's semi-wet. And I'm going to soften the edge of that cast shadow. And now I'm going to take my darkest color and dab and dot in those darkest areas of the cast shadow that are right up next to the leaf. There is, however, an area there toward the center of the leaf that I saw that was a little lighter. So I'm gonna actually leave that pretty light, maybe even dab out a little bit of paint from there so that it stays light. Now I'm going to finish those other areas of the cast shadow with that same process, using the lightest color first, softening the outer edges of the cast shadow, and then dotting in the darkest color to create those darkest areas of the cast shadow. Now this could be done, but I saw a few little things that I want to add into this before I call it finished. I'm going to take red and darken it. I can use green, or I can add in some of that blue-brown combination to make a darker red. I'm just going to put in a few spots or imperfections and also emphasize a little bit of the veins there right up next to the stem of the leaf. And I see a few darker sections of the vein, especially in the center. And that's it. So I'm going to give it plenty of time to dry. And now let's take a look at the finished product. And you can see this one's not quite as aggressively colored as the first one that I did. Also, I decided not to use the ink to outline the edges of this one. Okay, I'm all done with these. I hope you enjoyed that lesson, and I hope you all have a great day and can join me for the next demonstration.